Welcome to Solutions OP Clinical Trials Podcast. My name is Olga and I'm the Managing Director of Solutions OP. We're a small team of experienced professionals working on clinical trials in the United Kingdom. I'll use our podcast to discuss hot topics in clinical trials and provide analysis of the latest trends and challenges in pharma and medical device industries, not just in the UK but globally. Thank you for listening. Welcome to this episode of the podcast where we'll discuss how do we select investigators for clinical trials. So in the previous episode, we talked about patients participating in clinical trials and why there are less patients who participate in clinical trials. Now, today we'll talk about physicians and their role in clinical research and their interest in clinical research and how this affects the overall involvement in research on an even country level. So that's a very interesting topic, and it's closely related to how many patients we have who participate in clinical trials. So I don't have specific statistics about physicians who are interested in research, but my observation throughout the years is that there are not so many physicians who have interest in research and who are participating in clinical trials as investigators. So we'll talk about a little bit. So let's see why physicians may not be interested in clinical research and why we have not so many physicians interested. So I think the first maybe and main part is the lack of awareness and training. Because in the medical schools, they definitely teach them, how to treat patients and all that. But they don't necessarily teach them how to do research, how to, let's say, write their own clinical trial protocol, or, how to participate in what we call commercial study, which is funded and sponsored by a commercial company. So they don't necessarily have that knowledge, and there's no one to teach them how this is done. So maybe this is one big reason why many young physicians don't have experience and they don't have, a lot of interest in clinical research and in clinical trials. But that's not the only reason. Sometimes it's just a lack of personal interest in research. There's some people who they're quite happy and content to look after their patients, but they don't necessarily want to be involved in research. So they're quite happy as they are. It's fair enough. It's their choice at the end of the day, and it depends on the person and their personality. But another factor that I wanted to mention here is the lack of time. So as we all know, physicians around the globe, not just in the UK, but everywhere, they're quite stretched in terms of time, and hospitals are struggling with resources. So when you are quite overwhelmed with your existing patients, it's quite understanding that you won't want to take any more work. Because at the end of the day, participating in clinical research is additional work to their existing workload. And, time in this case, their time is really important factor. Even if they have interest, if they're quite stretched, they might not be able to participate in research. And I've seen that throughout the years. Sometimes physicians just get back to us during feasibility stage and say, well, we are interested, but unfortunately we just wouldn't have the time to do it. And fair enough, I can completely understand this argument. But let's talk about some other factors which impact participation of physicians in research. And I think another important one is the lack of mentoring. When you have especially young physicians who are just going on in practice and they work in different hospitals. If we want to involve them in research and we really want to get them keen on doing research themselves later on, at later stage, we need to be providing them adequate mentoring and support. So someone to supervise them and help them, just to navigate how to run a clinical trial or how to be a sub-investigator in a clinical trial, because this is important learning for them. And if they have a proper mentoring and proper supervisor who guides them and is supportive, I think a lot more physicians will be very keen to participate in research, because they will see the actual value of research that brings to patients. So this is something I really hope we can improve for all young physicians who are coming on board and who are involved in research in one way or another. And there is another factor here that we have to mention, is the lack of interest in the research topic. And it happens. It happens even, I would say, often. Sometimes you have a clinical trial, which is, it's not really boring, but it's not bringing any new value to the patients. And for some physicians, just doing research for the sake of research is not enough. They want to see that this research is actually helping their patients. And I can completely understand. So sometimes it's just there's no interest in the research topic. It happens especially if you have clinical trials where you have like a new drug formulation, but it's existing drugs. So they might not necessarily be super keen to participate, because they know the drug is already available on the market. So you're just trying new formulation. And for them, it's not a challenge, and probably doesn't bring value to their patients. So they might not be, personally interested in that kind of research, which I'm not saying everyone is not interested, but there will be some people that will not be interested. So after we review the potential challenges, I think it's important also to discuss what is the impact of physician participation in clinical research on the research in general. So what happens if we don't have many physicians interested in research? As a general, we'll see less research going on in the country. You'll see, of course, less patients having access to clinical trials, because if the physician is not taking any clinical trials to do themselves, there won't be more clinical trials coming, because there will be no interest, from the physician's point. And also, another impact is that you have less people involved in research on a hospital level. And, in order to have a good research center, you need to have not just experienced physicians, not just patients who are interested to participate, but you need to have the whole team who has experience and skills to do research. This involves research nurses and other supporting team like pharmacy, local lab, radiology, sometimes, different departments. They need to have experience in research in order to be able to support clinical trials on a hospital level. So if there is less research coming to the hospital, of course, these people will not have sufficient training. And this could impact really the research on a country level, because, there will be less studies coming and less access to new drugs and new medical devices, and of course less experience for people who could get experience on working on clinical trials. So as you can imagine, this is a really high impact. The physician's involvement in research is as important as patients' involvement in research. But let's talk about how do we select physicians to conduct clinical trials. So I'll talk more general, not specifically for UK, but there's some examples for UK that I'll give you. I think it's more or less globally people face similar similar issues at the moment in terms of selecting investigators for their studies. So the first important thing that we use before we select investigators is their expertise in the disease area. Of course, we want to consider people who are experts and who know what they're doing, who have experience many years. Ideally, they have experience in clinical research. That's important as well. But I think it's also important that we consider young physicians who are keen and interested to participate in research. And in many cases, companies tend to select, the big guns, I would say, the ones that are very famous and have very strong experience in their disease area. But I think we need to give chance to young investigators, because this is how we train people, and this is how we allow them to progress and become experts in their area when they're involved in research, and they gain this really good experience for them. So I think it's important to consider young investigators. In many cases, however, this might not be an option. For example, if you have a clinical trial in gene therapy, you need to have really a physician who is very experienced and ideally has experience in gene therapy as well. Because of the complexity of the trial, you need to have really someone who is very experienced. And in that particular case, selecting a young physician might not be the best option. But you can still involve any young physicians as sub-investigators at that hospital and, give them chance to work on the clinical trial. So the other option that we always consider when we select investigators in clinical trials is the key opinion leaders. So the key opinion leaders are normally physicians with a lot of experience and expertise who are involved in setting up the treatment guidelines on a country level. Of course, there are not many of them. There are quite a few in general, but in each specific disease area, you might not have lots of experts in the country who are involved in this as a key opinion leaders. So the great benefit of having key opinion leaders, of course, is you have their expertise. They can also advise you on treatment practices at the moment and any upcoming changes in the treatment practices. So their knowledge, of course, is extremely valuable. But at the same time, there are some challenges in terms of key opinion leaders. Very often, companies always go after the key opinion leaders, and they have a very high volume of clinical trials. As you can imagine, that would lead to a very high workload. And very often, what we've observed is they have a low recruitment rate at the hospitals. They recruit less patients, and generally, they're not that involved in the clinical trial. It's not because they don't want to. I think we need to be clear on this one. It's because these key opinion leaders, they're involved in many different committees, they go to different meetings, conferences. So I think it's just physically they don't have the time to be that involved in the clinical trial. So very often things are done by sub-investigators at the hospitals, and it is challenging. So that's something that we need to consider, when we select sites, because we need to not just consider the ones who are key opinion leaders, but we need to consider recruitment as well and the hospitals and the physicians who have actually the time to run the clinical trial and, can recruit a good amount of patients. So that's a important factor. Another thing about the key opinion leaders is very often the companies make mistakes. They want to involve as many as possible key opinion leaders. So if there are 3 or 4 people in the country who are key opinion leaders in this disease indication, they'll just approach all of them and they'll push them really hard to take this clinical trial. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because sometimes one person might be interested and might be willing to take the study, but the others might not necessarily be interested. So we need to respect their opinion. And if they're not keen and you see them a bit reluctant, you have to let them, decline the study and not try to push them into something they don't want to do, because at the end they won't be able to recruit. They have their own reason why they're not willing to take the study. It could be just because they have resources and they're not able to take any more studies at this point. But companies, I can understand they're very keen to have the key opinion leaders. And I think it's important to remember that we need to respect their wishes as well and not try to force them into something they don't want to do. Another important complication of having several key opinion leaders on a clinical trial is, for example, in the UK, we need to have a chief investigator. Normally, if you have a key opinion leader, one person, you just approach this person and ask him to be a chief investigator. But if you have 2 or 3 people, it gets really complicated, because the sponsor is supposed to select who will be the chief investigator, and you have, these experts. You don't want to give preference to one over the others, because the others might get upset, that they've not been picked up as the chief investigators. So I think it's when we select sites and investigators for clinical trial, we really need to be thinking carefully and make good choices, and not try to force people, and at the same time, select sites that will recruit patients. So that's an important thing. So another thing I wanted to mention in terms of selecting sites for clinical trials is it's very important also the experience of the clinical research team. Sometimes you might have a very experienced investigator, but the research team could be quite new and not very experienced, simply because there is a high turnover at the hospital and they're having resource issues. So in this case, of course, you can still select this hospital, but you need to keep in mind that the people working on the study are not so experienced. So they need a lot more hand-holding and a lot more support to do the study. So that's something that you need to evaluate before you make the decision if you're selecting a specific hospital or not. And you can see the opposite. You may have a very experienced team, but the investigator might be, quite new to research. I mean, he's been working as a sub-investigator, but maybe he's never worked as a principal investigator in a clinical trial. In such cases, you need to provide a bit more support to that investigator until they get used to what they need to do and, feel more comfortable. So that's an important part. Then another very important part is the hospital suitability. So one of the things we need to identify before selecting any hospitals is to understand if they actually have capacity. Because sometimes hospitals are very busy and they don't have capacity to take more studies. And even if you select this investigator and he's very keen to participate and the team is keen, it might be that the hospital actually has no capacity to start any new clinical trials, and you might need to wait until you be able to set them up. So that's something that it's important to understand on the very, very early stage, as much as you can, of course, what kind of capacity the hospital has, and if you need to have any delays, what kind of delays you can expect. So that's another important thing to have in mind when selecting sites. And of course, you need to make sure that they have all the necessary equipment to conduct the clinical trial, because this is sometimes a challenge as well. Some hospitals may not have all the equipment that other hospitals will have. So that's something to consider. And the last thing, which I want to mention is, of course, it's always good to have input from the CRAs, or if you're using a CRO, input from people who you work with and who work with this hospital. If they can provide you some feedback about setup of the hospital, any challenges, any current resource issues or any delays, anything like that. So it's good always to speak to CRAs who work with the sites as well, and hear feedback from them. So in conclusion, what I want to summarize is that we need to have more physicians involved in research, because only after they're interested in research, we can have more treatment options and access to new therapies and medical devices for our patients. But in order to do this, there are a few things that we need to consider. So we need to consider more training options for young physicians in medical school, but also workshops and different other opportunities to give them access to research. Another thing that we need to consider is to have more adequate mentoring for young physicians. It's not just on a hospital level by senior physicians, but also by the sponsor of the clinical trial, because the sponsors could also provide support and guidance to them when they need in making treatment decisions or in managing adverse events. So this is important support that we need to provide to young physicians and help them learn, not only about research, but about the drug and the management of patients in general. I think this is a really a vital part of getting physicians who are experts and they're very comfortable working with patients and prescribing medications and so on. So it is important that they have this exposure to research. And of course, another thing which I think is a good option is to have some encouragement for participating in research, even if it is recognition or any career development opportunities or additional payments. Because if we have to be honest, this is additional work for them. They have their day practice, they see these patients, and they have patients who participate in clinical trials, which will have more frequent visits, more involvement from the physicians. So if that's an extra work for them, it makes sense that this extra work is paid, and that will definitely encourage them to be more involved in research, and I think it's a good opportunity to look into. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope this topic was interesting for you, and we'll see what's next. Thank you.